On that gray Ohio autumn day, Loretta, a 73-year-old woman with weary lungs and a memory filled with silent sacrifices, began to understand that life could change in a single day. She had spent decades in a textile factory in Columbus, breathing in chemicals that clung to her skin and cotton fibers that seemed to linger in her throat for hours, even after she arrived home. Much of her adult life had been devoted to her son, Deacon, stuffing crumpled bills into coffee cans hidden in the closet to ensure he could study without owing a penny to anyone. For her, that effort was a form of love, though she would never call it that aloud. And now, with emphysema slowly consuming her breath and her independence, she found herself crossing the threshold of her son's perfect home, believing she had arrived at a refuge, unaware that she was entering the most painful scene of her life. In the preceding months, Loretta had battled the shame that weighed on her chest more than the lack of oxygen. She tried to survive on her $1,100 disability benefit, turning off lights, skipping meals, cutting pills in half to make them last longer. But even that wasn't enough to keep her small apartment, and one day, her hands trembling and her pride shattered, she called Deacon. He answered with a new, almost bureaucratic coldness, saying he had to check with Sloan. Even so, they agreed to let her move in, though it was clear from the first minute that it was out of obligation, not affection. Sloan greeted her with an impeccable smile, like the magazines on the table, but his eyes showed that Loretta's presence was a nuisance in his perfectly calculated life. He immediately imposed rules, schedules, forbidden spaces, and absurd payments that would consume almost all of her income. And so, without realizing it, Loretta went from being a self-sacrificing mother to an unwanted guest in the house she had helped to build with years of effort. As the weeks passed, the spacious, gleaming house began to feel like a cold, windowless display case, perfect to look at, impossible to live in. Sloan corrected everything Loretta did, from the way she folded the towels to the way she loaded the dishwasher, as if her every gesture tainted the home's minimalist aesthetic. Loretta tried to compensate by cooking, cleaning, doing small favors, but it was never enough. Deacon, meanwhile, would come home from work smelling of expensive bourbon, his tie barely loosened, and go straight to his office. Without asking how she was feeling, as if she were a shadow, and not the woman who had worked her entire life to support him. Sometimes at night, Loretta would hear muffled laughter behind the closed door, conversations about trips, dinners, and unnecessary expenses, all while she counted out coins to buy her inhaler. This contrast wore her down, but she didn't yet know that the worst was yet to come. The emphysema began to advance like a silent enemy. Every step was a battle, every morning, beginning with a deep, burning cough. Loretta took crowded buses to respiratory therapy, carrying bags too heavy for her frail arms, returning to a house where no one seemed to notice her absence or her effort. Sloan would insinuate, amid seemingly casual remarks, that the old smell lingered in the rooms when she walked by, prompting Loretta to shower several times a day just to avoid further humiliation. Even so, a part of her still believed that if she pushed herself a little harder, one day, Deacon would look at her with gratitude. But that hope was shattered in a single afternoon, in a scene so jarring that Loretta would remember every detail as if it were seared into her skin. That day, Loretta returned from physical therapy exhausted, feeling as if the air were thinning with every step. Opening the door, she found the kitchen enveloped in a thick, almost blue cloud of smoke swirling under the white light of the spotlights. Sloan was leaning against the marble countertop, smoking, with an irritating nonchalance, as if this weren't a shared home but a set designed for a high-end commercial. Loretta felt a sharp pain in her chest immediately. The smell of cigarettes transported her back decades to the crowded corridors of the textile factory, where each inhalation was a reminder that her body was paying a price. Her voice trembling, but not rising, she begged her not to smoke inside, or at least to do it outside. She explained that her lungs were already stretched to their limits, that even a little more smoke could destabilize her. Sloan, without taking her eyes off her phone, let out a dry laugh, and replied that she smoked wherever she pleased. The already humiliating situation turned brutal when Deacon entered the kitchen. He only heard part of her sentence, the part that could be interpreted as a complaint. His eyes, once warm toward her, were now sharp and impatient, as if Loretta were a burden disrupting his perfect life. In a matter of seconds, he began, accusing her of exaggerating, of playing the victim, of always having something. Loretta tried to calmly explain that she was simply looking after her health, but Deacon exploded with unexpected violence. His own son's hand flew through the air and struck her in the face with such force that she staggered, with a metallic taste in her mouth and ringing in her ears. Sloane didn't even flinch. She stubbed out her cigarette in the sink, grabbed her purse, and asked what they wanted to eat out. So, amid soft laughter and the sound of the BMW keys, they both left, leaving Loretta alone in a smoky kitchen, her cheek burning and her soul even more broken than her body. It took Loretta several minutes to regain feeling in her legs. She leaned against the table, her breath coming in short gasps as the smoke slowly dissipated. The red mark on her cheek was beginning to darken, and in the silence of the house, the sound of the blow echoed repeatedly, refusing to fade. She walked slowly to the guest room, that cold, almost characterless space where she had tried to create a minimal sense of home, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser. The woman she saw there wasn't just a tired old woman. She was someone who had endured too much for too long. Her eyes, clouded with tears she had held back, reflected something new, something akin to a determination that had lain dormant for years. That was the precise moment Loretta understood that no one was going to save her, except herself. She sat up in bed, breathing heavily, the pain in her cheek mingling with a sudden painful clarity. She remembered the hidden cans of coffee, the smell of wet cotton at the factory, the cuts on her hands, everything she had done for the son who now saw her as a burden. And it was precisely in this emotional whirlwind that she felt the need to speak to whoever was reading her story, as if searching for a witness so she wouldn't feel so alone. And if you're reading all this and you're still with me, tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes sharing your origins is also a way to avoid feeling invisible. That sentence didn't break the narrative in her mind. On the contrary, it accompanied her as she picked up her phone, determined to do something she had never imagined, to ask for real help. With trembling hands, Loretta opened the contact list she almost never used. She didn't call Deacon. There was nothing left to expect from him. Instead, she wrote brief, almost shy messages to the 3 people who, at some point in her life, had seen her worth when she herself couldn't. Marcus Chen, the boy she had helped years before and who was now a prominent lawyer. Rhonda Washington, her childhood friend, a tireless journalist. And Vincent Torres, Deacon's former roommate whom Loretta had fed so many times that he still called her his second mom. She told them only the essentials, the assault, the conditions in which she lived, the smoke, the constant humiliation. She wasn't expecting much, perhaps some advice or an "I'm sorry," but in less than 20 minutes all 3 responded with a forcefulness that shook her to her core. She wasn't alone, even though she had felt it for years. Marcus asked her not to touch anything in the house, to leave every detail exactly as it was because it would serve as evidence. Rhonda asked permission to go in and document everything, while Vincent was already reviewing numbers, extracting data, and preparing a forensic analysis of the financial abuse. Loretta, her cheek still stinging, began to gather evidence without realizing she'd been accumulating it for months. Photos of the mold on the wall, the small unventilated bathroom, her incomplete prescriptions, the absurd bills she'd been charged. And as she organized the files on her phone, she felt a different pulse in her chest, a mixture of nerves and renewed strength. The next morning, the house seemed quieter than usual, as if it sensed what was about to happen. Deacon and Sloane were having breakfast at the Marble Island, discussing reservations for a late brunch, as if the previous night had been completely normal. Loretta stayed in a corner, breathing carefully without looking up. When the doorbell rang, Sloane frowned. They weren't expecting anyone. Upon opening it, They found Marcus Chen with a thick folder in his hand and a professional expression that immediately froze the room. He introduced himself as Loretta's lawyer and announced that from that moment on, an investigation was being initiated for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and physical assault. Deacon paled. Sloan took a step back, unable to process the scene. Loretta, from the hallway, felt a mixture of fear and relief that almost made her lose her balance. Marcus's arrival was just the beginning. Within minutes, Rhonda arrived with a photographer, documenting every corner that showed signs of neglect or mistreatment. Shortly after, an investigator from the Elderly Protective Services, EPS, walked through the door, notebook in hand, her expert eye taking in every detail. She interviewed Loretta carefully, asked to see her medication, inspected her bedroom, and noted the inflated receipts and absurd restrictions Sloan had imposed. Finally, Vincent Torres appeared with a folder full of financial statements. Without raising his voice, he began to explain that Deacon and Sloan not only earned over $600,000 a year together, but also owned investments, a vacation home, and enough liquid assets to live comfortably without needing to ask the ailing mother for a penny. Faced with this avalanche of data, the two were exposed and speechless. The pressure on Deacon and Sloan rose like an inexorable tide. The APS investigator concluded on the spot that Loretta couldn't remain in that environment. The moldy room, the abusive restrictions, the exorbitant charges for water and food, it all painted a clear picture of abuse. Marcus, in his firm but controlled tone, explained that he was already laying the groundwork for a strong legal case. Rhonda, from the back of the room, announced that she was working on a story about elder abuse in affluent families and that Loretta's case would be a central focus. Vincent added that the financial exploitation was so blatant that any judge would see the pattern immediately. Deacon seemed to sink deeper into his own silence, and Sloan, for the first time, displayed an expression that wasn't arrogance, but fear. It was then that Marcus proposed a settlement that hit the couple like a ton of bricks. A full refund of all the money Loretta had paid since moving into the house, lifetime coverage for her medical treatments, a public apology in the local newspaper, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting them from approaching her. He also proposed creating a scholarship fund for adult children caring for elderly parents, with mandatory contributions for 10 years, something that would serve as both symbolic reparation and a social commitment. Sloan, almost voiceless, said that this would ruin his professional reputation in the medical industry. Deacon, staring blankly, understood too late that ambition and contempt had brought him to the brink of losing everything, even his dignity. Loretta watched the scene in silence, feeling for the first time in a long time that someone was standing up for her, when the APS confirmed that Loretta had to leave. The house immediately, Marcus readily offered her his own guest house while they looked for a permanent solution. Sloan tried to object, saying it was all a misunderstanding, but the investigator cut her off with utter composure. The evidence was overwhelming. Rhonda asked permission to continue documenting the process, while Vincent prepared the final pages of the financial analysis. Loretta, with her few belongings in a bag she had used for years, felt something unexpected. Relief. It wasn't complete happiness, but it was the feeling that she was finally crossing a threshold she should have crossed long ago. As she left, she heard Deacon call after her in a low voice, but his words weren't apologies, just desperate attempts to control the narrative in front of the others. She didn't turn around. Now temporarily settled in Marcus's house, Loretta allowed herself something she hadn't done in months: breathe without fear. The air didn't smell of smoke or harsh cleaning products. The room had natural light and a soft blanket that Rhonda had left on the bed before leaving. Vincent came by that same afternoon to install a small bird feeder on the window, saying that winged company always helps. Loretta smiled for the first time in a long time, a small, shy, but genuine smile. Even so, she knew that rebuilding her life wouldn't be immediate. Her body was tired, and her heart even more so, but something inside her, something that had been dormant since the days when she hid money and coffee cans for her son's future, was beginning to awaken with a quiet strength. As the days passed, Loretta's story began to circulate thanks to Rhonda's report. It wasn't a sensationalist piece, but a profound portrait of the silent abuse so many elderly people face within their own families. Loretta's photo, a discreet shot of her hands resting on a knitted blanket, accompanied an article that spoke of structural injustices, generational ingratitude, and how maternal love can be manipulated into a chain. The scholarship fund required by the settlement began receiving donations from other citizens, with messages saying things like, "So that no mother ever has to go through this again." Marcus reviewed the final documents of the case, and Vincent made sure that every stolen penny was returned. Little by little, Loretta began to understand that her pain was no longer just hers. It had become a spark for much broader change. With her money repaid and her health insurance guaranteed for life, Loretta decided to look for her own apartment, small but bright, where she could truly feel at home. She found one near a park, with an adapted bathroom and heating that worked without any metallic clangs. On the day she moved in, Marcus carried boxes, Vincent hung the curtains, and Rhonda stocked the pantry with food she knew Loretta could eat without difficulty. That afternoon, sitting by the window with a cup of hot tea, she watched a cardinal land on the feeder and gently flap its wings. That simple image felt like a rebirth to her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel she had to tiptoe around her own home. She was free, and she knew it. Several months passed before Deacon reappeared in her life, breaking, to Loretta's shock, the restraining order. He arrived one cloudy afternoon, his shirt wrinkled and his eyes sunken, as if he had aged years in just a few weeks. When she opened the door just a crack, he held up a check for $50,000 and said he wanted to make up for all the damage. He confessed that he had lost his job, that Sloan had left him, and that he hadn't been able to sleep since that night in the kitchen. Loretta listened in silence, watching the man she had raised with such sacrifice, who now seemed empty inside. Yet something within her, something deep, dignified, knew that repentance couldn't erase the blow, the months of humiliation, or the emotional abandonment of an entire lifetime. With a calmness that surprised even her own weakened body, Loretta returned the check and told him she didn't need his money, but rather that he learn, at least once in his life, to treat others with respect. "Love without respect is not love," she told him, and those words seemed to pierce him like a slow knife. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She simply closed the door gently as Deacon stood there, motionless, holding a piece of paper that no longer held any meaning. That night, Loretta slept soundly for the first time in decades. She knew she had chosen peace over repeating a cycle of pain, and that she had finally broken a chain she had unknowingly dragged her entire life. As the weeks passed, Loretta's life settled into a calm, almost therapeutic rhythm. She grew accustomed to the sounds of the neighborhood, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional whisper of the wind through the park's branches, and the gentle tapping of birds visiting her window. She began attending a community group for older adults where she shared laughter, recipes, and anecdotes that helped her rebuild the confidence that Deacon's house had shattered. People listened to her with a respect that felt strange at first. She wasn't used to her voice mattering. But day by day, word by word, she remembered that she, too, had a story worth telling without shame or fear. The scholarship fund, initially established as a court-ordered measure, began to grow beyond anyone's expectations. Young people caring for their ailing parents sent letters thanking them for the opportunity to continue their studies. Entire families wrote saying that Loretta's story had inspired them to reevaluate how they treated their elders. Even the APS publicly cited the case as an example of what can be achieved when an entire community decides not to turn a blind eye. For Loretta, each letter was a reminder that her suffering had not been in vain. She realized that, without intending to, she had become a kind of silent beacon for those living through the same struggles. And although she still had difficult days, she no longer felt alone in them. One day, while organizing a box of old papers, Loretta found a faded photograph. Deacon in his cap and gown, smiling with a joy so pure it almost hurt to look at him. For a few seconds she had to sit down because the memory hit her hard. It wasn't nostalgia nor regret. It was a kind of silent mourning for the son he once was, who, somewhere along the way, had faded away. She put the photo away in a drawer, not to forget him, but to acknowledge that she had loved a child who no longer existed, and to accept that the man who remained was not someone who could have a secure place in her life. That small act felt like closing a door quietly, with a dignity that only those who have suffered in silence can understand. Over time, Loretta's health began to improve more than her doctors had expected. Having consistent access to her medication, living in a warm, smoke-free space, and feeling that her life had purpose again, transformed her body almost as much as her spirit. She began walking in the park in the mornings, greeting the same faces that, little by little, became familiar. Sometimes she carried a thermos of tea and sat on a bench to watch the families go by, the dogs running free, the children laughing, unaware that she, too, was learning to laugh again. It was curious how simple it was to feel alive when no one was oppressing her. There, under the gentle sun, she discovered that freedom doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it enters life on tiptoe, like a bird landing silently. With the boost of her newfound stability, Loretta decided to volunteer at a community center that assisted vulnerable seniors. She couldn't carry heavy boxes or walk long distances, but she could listen, guide, and above all, recognize signs that others overlooked. On more than one occasion, someone would tell her a story that began with, "I don't want to bother my children," and Loretta would feel a deep resonance in her chest. She spoke to them with a firm gentleness, that blend of tenderness and truth that only comes from experience. Some cried, others took her hand, and several told her that thanks to her, they had found the courage to ask for help. For the first time in decades, Loretta didn't feel like a burden. She felt useful, needed, valued. One afternoon, on her way home from the community center, she found an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a letter written in Deacon's shaky handwriting. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, nor was he trying to justify anything. He simply said that he was in therapy, that he thought about her every day, and that he hoped that someday she could forgive him, even if only silently. Loretta read the letter slowly, unhurriedly, letting each word settle within her, and, surprisingly, she felt neither anger nor sadness. She felt distance, a healthy, mature distance that no longer hurt. She put the letter in a box with other important papers. Not to keep him, but to preserve the lesson, that some relationships can only heal when you stop trying to recapture what no longer exists. Months later, Loretta realized she no longer checked the door expecting shadows from the past. Her routine had become a safe haven. Morning tea, leisurely walks, visits to the community center, the birds that perched on her window like daily guests. Sometimes, while arranging her medications or folding the blanket on the sofa, she reflected on everything she had endured. The sacrifice, the contempt, the violence, and finally, justice. She wasn't trying to erase anything. Every scar had a purpose, even the invisible ones. What mattered was that she no longer lived under the roof of someone who saw her as a burden. She had gained what had once seemed impossible, a home of her own and a life where respect was no longer a negotiation, but a non-negotiable foundation. The day she received confirmation that the scholarship fund had financed its 100th student, Loretta wept, but this time with pride. Her pain had produced something that would continue to exist even after she was gone. She thought about the silent chains so many elderly people carry, woven from fear, dependency, and shame, and understood that breaking them had not only saved her own life, but also the lives of others. That afternoon, she recorded a short message for the community group where she shared her story, that no one should accept being invisible within their own family, that asking for help is not a defeat, and that even in the final years of life, it is still possible to rise, rebuild, and shine. Then she turned off the light, took a deep breath, clean air, her own, smoke-free, and smiled with the simple yet powerful certainty that she had closed her story not with resentment but with freedom.